Yeah, welcome back. Um, so today is going to be the day, right? We're going to jump into PHP, which is, so let me just see where we are. Um, we are at 3.3, so we're going to jump into our first programming language. Which is great. So HTML is just a markup language. PHP is the first programming language. CSS is also just like a declaration. Like we haven't really programmed yet. And now we're basically going to get real, if you want so. If this is the first video you watch, there's a couple of things that might be a little bit confusing. So I am kind of going to assume that you watched like every video that came before that. So I know that's a little bit of a time commitment, but we're going to have like an approach where it makes sense to be familiar with a couple of processes, basically. So PHP, what is that? Let me just quickly do that. I call that the web language. Why? Because PHP is widely used when it comes to server-side all-purpose languages, and is probably dominating the web when it comes to how many pages are run on it. So PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. That's a little bit of a joke. That's historically, by the way, it had a different name, and what is it, homepage? I actually forgot the original name, but it was basically then dubbed Hypertext Preprocessor, and that is a recursion in itself. So what does PHP stand for? Well, for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, right? So PHP. And what does the PHP itself stand for? Well, of course, for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. So, and that goes on forever. You can imagine what I mean. That's something typically nerdy and programmy, is to basically say this iterates eternal. It is easy to learn and easy to misuse. So that is one of the big reasons why PHP is very polarizing. So a lot of people hate it, a lot of people love it. The reason why it is hated so much has a lot to do with how it was originally used, and how easy it is to use it with very bad practices. The better reasons when it comes to inconsistencies, that's something that people bring forward as a reason. I always have to smile about that, because the reasons that they normally put out there and examples, they're accurate, but nonetheless, PHP is just as inconsistent as many other languages as well, and therefore, I mean, you can take that with a grain of salt if you want so. Easy to learn, that is actually something that I haven't considered myself for the longest time. So there are a couple of languages I write in my daily work, and I always bought into the narrative of Python is basically the learning language. Because it's so close to the English language, and therefore it's easy to pick up. But without going too much into detail, I heard very interesting arguments of why that might not necessarily be the case, and what similarities PHP has to other concepts, and especially when you start thinking about classes and so on. Python is not really logical in a lot of basic setups, and it doesn't really foster understanding when it comes to a couple of ways a language would interpret something. PHP is the fastest interpreted language. So in general, you have always two types of languages, at least when we're talking web. One would be interpreted, and one would be compiled, right? So something like Java is something that you need to compile. So it basically, well, the output of what you're coding is something that gets interpreted and not what you're coding directly. Languages like PHP or Python or JavaScript are interpreted languages, which basically means that it's going to be everything happens at runtime. So when it's executed, so what you write is also what gets executed, and that gets a little bit more complicated with actually how the engine works. But just for you to understand, there is no difference between what the interpreter reads and what you read as a human. Now, the age of WordPress. This is something that I put out there because WordPress is to this day probably the dominating CMS, and I don't like to call it framework, but that's how it's used nowadays on the web. And that already started, I would say, the big age of WordPress was with PHP 4.6, and then going forward, it is still very dominant. And the way it is written is probably also the reason why a lot of people like dislike PHP. And it's kind of not or semi their fault. So a lot of practices were introduced pretty early. We would do all of that differently nowadays. However, if you are somebody like WordPress as an organization, you need to be backward compatible. I mean, think about the thousands upon thousands of plugins and sites and you name it that need to stay compatible to changes in the WordPress structure, and that accounts for a lot of the things that I personally dislike about WordPress, and that's why if you look at WordPress code, it's very convoluted and really not separated nicely, and well, I mean, really not the best way to write PHP. I mean, it is approachable, but it is a weird concept. Then nowadays, the age of Laravel is basically what we're currently in, if you want so. So that's a little bit my take on it. So I mean, there's so many like solid frameworks, right? I mean, symphonies, and I mean they're really strong PHP frameworks. But there's always like kind of like for the commoners, right? So WordPress and Laravel, they're both very approachable. They're easy to pick up. And both of them have the problem that you don't really work in the language. A little bit more with WordPress, I have to admit. With Laravel, you have the strangest effect that a lot of people don't really write. A lot of people that are Laravel developers aren't PHP developers, so they don't. It doesn't foster an understanding of actual PHP and of what's actually happening. I mean, this is just like. It's so abstracted that they're just a level away of what's happening. Too much is taken care of. For you, it's very opinionated, and it is therefore, I think, not ideal to start with Laravel. However, compared to WordPress, it is structured logically. It is very clean. It forces you to use a lot of good practices, and it's definitely an enormous step forward from other frameworks. And it might be a hype right now, but we also have to acknowledge that it is, well, somewhat a reason for the revival of PHP, and it has brought the community forward a lot. So I think that Laravel overall is an interesting approach. Also with their CLIs, like Eloquent and Illuminate and all that kind of stuff that they basically build in, is interesting as a concept. We will go not too much into different frameworks because we actually want to learn the language, but there's a lot out there. Not always when I say stuff like approachable. So I mean, something like CodeIgniter would be approachable, but I would not recommend starting with a framework like that. It's easy to pick up, but it's a terrible tool set to work with. I'm going to be honest. I'm trying to be neutral, but I mean that's just not the way you want to work with anything. Then there are like kind of specialized frameworks like Slim that are well designed to basically provide APIs and are very lightweight and are almost more like a library than a framework. Those all have their place, and there are countless more. They're really solid all-purpose frameworks. We will look into one of them more specifically, but again, here we really want to go into actual PHP, the actual learning of PHP. Now, what we will also do is we will learn PHP in a way that translates to the basics of any programming language, which basically means that, for example, like what are variables, how to use them, how to declare them, and so on. There are differences in languages when it comes to that, but at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter. It's more or less just a different form of writing something to achieve exactly the same. We will basically understand what I mean by that when we jump into code. So the output, I go print. This is like, okay, so you're programming something. How do you get that out to well, the browsers of your visitors, basically. That's something we're going to talk about also from a level where it translates to other languages. Loops, what are loops? What are they used for? Why do we need them? And so on. That's again also something that every programming language has. Conditions and operators, same thing. So how do we basically create flow of code? And then we already jump into something a little bit more complex, like functions, classes, inheritance. We will see what that means, what it's used for, and so on. And then we have like include, autoload namespaces. That's almost a little bit advanced, but we will at least sniff into it to understand, okay, what is happening when I'm looking at legacy code? How do I handle myself through it? And last but not least, templating. Now, as a little bit of a add-on, if you want. So, I mean, we have talked about relational databases, but what we want to do here, at least, is to understand that while PHP itself, or actually any backend language itself, doesn't really directly handle databases, we have possibilities to talk to databases. And how that is done is something that we're basically going to introduce a little bit. So we're going to talk about how to generate a connection. So that's with the onboard methods, that would be MySQLi or PDO. We will see what that means and what that's used for. And on a very basic level, going to start with SQL, so the language that is basically then used directly by the database, and a little bit of a reminder and the setup of okay, so like going to have a very primitive example of how does this database basically operate, and we're going to make some really basic operations of getting information out, putting information in. Yeah, that's basically what we want to have. Now, I started to record this, and let me see where we are. Yes, so let me get rid of all of this because I crashed my computer in the process of starting all of this. So please ignore like most of the files here. What I did is I started to, basically here you can see the templates, the topics again. I will basically start with generating a index.php file in the folder. Again, we're in videos in this case, so directly in my local host, right? This is the first one you want to see. And actually, let's even get rid of this. So every PHP file should, in your case, start with what you see here in line 1. So lower than question mark PHP. This tells the interpreter that now we're looking at PHP code, right? This has historical reasons. Let me actually do just something that we see that. So if I were to go here and say, okay, localhost video, and I should see the hello world. Index. This is again a little bit like the index HTML. Should you still have the index HTML in your video folder, get rid of it. It normally takes precedence depending on. I thought we installed the Apache, right? It doesn't matter. Like, get rid of it. So you can make sure that the index PHP is executed. If that doesn't work outside of the box, put it in here. See, this is exactly the same. And this is basically our easy hello world example. So historically speaking, this is why we say, okay, this starts the PHP code. We need that for a very simple reason. So back in the days, and again, unfortunately, you still see that sometimes, you would have stuff like this, right? Where you say, I don't know, headline, right? So you see regular HTML, and in between there is PHP code, right? You see that actually a lot, where, oops, this is actually a typo, where you would see like really, really ugly things like this. Oops, it doesn't even allow me that. Okay. Right, stuff like that. Right, whenever you see that, you know, you don't want to work with that. But that's basically historically how this all started. So PHP was a templating language, and that's also why it's still to this day string based. We will get into that in a second, and that is how it was used. So nowadays, what we do is, okay, so we are going to basically, oops, start with our PHP. And we will not have any kind of HTML in here. I mean, in the rarest of cases do we ever write a tag here, whatever. So this is basically what we do. We don't have to close it. So PHP is a particular kind of tag, and in theory, this is how you close the tag. As you can see, my IDE already bitches at me and say it's redundant. Like, we don't need this, and I agree. There's no reason to ever stop the interpretation of PHP. That's just what we're basically going to do. So in the very first topic, we are going to talk about variables. What are variables? Variables are basically named quite accurately. It is an assignment of, you know, a particular value to something that we can work with. And that is actually easier to explain if I show it to you. So again, let me actually just quickly have an output here of this. So I define a variable in PHP with a $sign. Every variable starts with a $sign, and then I have a name, in that case variable, which is of course a very stupid name. And then I can make an assignment. So an assignment is a simple equal sign, and in that case, then I'm going to have a string, and I'm going to close the assignment, or actually this line of code here, and complete it with a semicolon. A semicolon is, by the way, the most logical way. You will find that in almost every language, and at the end of the day, there are only two options. So either you use some kind of end of command, like the semicolon, or you do that by line break and indentation, which Python, for example, uses, or coffee, or I mean, there, you know, or SAS. I mean, there are different things that would do that. So that is basically the easiest way to describe it. So this should now basically just say hi, right? Yes. So what we're doing here is basically saying, okay, so I have an assignment and I assign a string to it. Now what a string is basically character-based well, values, right? So hi would definitely be a string, and every string needs to be understood as such, which basically means I need to have these quotes here in order to make PHP understand what that is. If I omit those quotes, then you can see it doesn't know what that is. It expects this to be, in that case, a constant, which is a particular form of variable, and it cannot be interpreted that way. So this is basically how I would write a string. Now, what you see a lot, and this has good reasons, let's do the following and say world is world. What you see a lot is that people have different styles and logic of when to apply single quotes and double quotes. Okay, so the reason for that has a lot to do with language and interpretation. So in this scenario, for example, if I say here I'm going to say hello world, what you will find is that this $world is not interpreted. It is just a string, right? See that? If I were to put this in double quotes though, and say, okay, please interpret it like this, then it now says world, because that is the value of the variable world. See that? Let's put an exclamation mark here to make it clearer. So now it's interpreted. And this goes with a couple of things. What we can also do is if I do it like this, and you probably don't see that because we don't have, that makes sense. I'm going to look at it this way. Actually, I'm going to even look at it this way. So here I see that now the line break character is placed here, which basically puts the world in the next line, right? I don't see that. However, if I were to, oops, am I stuck? No. Yeah, I'm stuck. Completely. Okay. Wow. I hope the recording still works. Interesting behavior. If I were to put single lines here, then what I would see is that let's go back here, that neither is the variable nor the new line character interpreted. Right? So now I have the possibility to actually write something like that without causing an error. Of course, I can just place HTML in there, in which case the line break would work. But first of all, it would work like this as well. And I might have some logical reasons to decide, certain things. So the problem that I have, of course, here is if I say hello sum, that now I cannot write $sum. See that? It is not, I cannot, so this doesn't exist as a string. I cannot basically show this. If I want to say, hey, this is how you write a variable in PHP, I have the problem that this will not work now. And let me actually put the error reporting back. You can ignore that. Reporting all this is normally something you set in your INI. I'm going to do that right here now. Okay. So I'm just going to do that so we can basically see what are the issues that the interpreter has. So here this is a notice undefined variable sum, right? So yeah, this doesn't really work, right? And I can actually use the backslash to say please stop interpretation of this. Why is the backslash something that I introduced already? Well, because think of the following scenario. So if I say this is John's PC, then this works, of course, fine. However, if I have single quotes, then what happens is, and you can see that it's kind of freaking out here. What happens is that, and I can't even execute this right now, that the string that I'm defining ends here, right? So I need to say, please don't interpret this as a as the end of the string. Interpret it as part of the string, right? So this is something that if you go to regular expressions, all of those things that I'm introducing right now make more sense. But this is basically telling the interpreter, no, please, ignore that. This is part of the string, and then you can see that it works just fine. Now, this phenomenon is something that, especially in the English language, this is used a lot, and that is why a lot of people use double quotes for variables. Depending on how you hand variables and how it ultimately translates to how it's used and so on, will basically define what is wiser to do. There are a lot of arguments on both ends. I personally recommend the single quoted logic because it, at the end of the day, plays nicer with JavaScript. We will get to that way later, but it has disadvantages as well. So just to show you basically how things also work is, okay, so this doesn't work, right? I cannot say hello world, and it would not interpret this now. But what I can, of course, do is I can say, okay, no, hello, and then, and this is how you concatenate a string or amend something to a string in PHP, and then say world, right? And that will work just fine. So we can write this differently as well. So we said any kind of assignment is an equal sign. But what we could also do is to say, okay, dot equal sign is world. I'm going to get rid of it here. And that's going to be the same. So this basically, as you can see it here, this is still the same output. This is the same as if I were to write, okay, I'm going to override it. So variable equals. So here now I override it, right? When I say equals world. Actually, let's quickly test this. See, now it's overwritten. Now it's only world. I've overwritten the hello. But what I can of course do is I can say, okay, variable equals variable and world. And I get the same output. So instead of writing that, I can basically say, no, just amend. And we still have the same output. Oh, I need to get rid of that, of course. Otherwise I have it twice. Right, so now I set it. Actually, I don't need any of this. Sorry about that. Now I set it to hello, and I amend the world, which has the value world exclamation point. And that's basically how I can generate my output. Now, the very strange thing, strange in the sense of unusual thing, is that PHP is very gracious when it comes to types. Now, in theory, I always said string, that is a particular type of value, right? So this world would now basically be a string, right? Which basically means if I let me actually make some kind of different thing here. So I can do things like say, okay, let me actually okay, we're gonna say number 1 is 101, and we're going to say number 2 is, I don't know, 50. Okay. So here we're now going to say, okay, number 1 plus number 2. So the output that we're getting is, of course, a result of 101 plus 50, right? So both of those, and you can see I do not need any kind of quotes here, because this is now an integer. This is now a number, and it works as such, right? So it can just be interpreted like that. But if I now say like, okay, I want to amend this, right? What happens now is that if I now it basically understands it as a string. So there's 101, and then we amend 50. So now we have 10150. See that? And that's basically the big difference from other languages that would now say, no, you can't do that. You can't amend it like that, right? In the same way, if I were to say, okay, so this is a string. See how it starts to say, no, this doesn't work. So now it is the string 101. It is not a number. It is not a number unless I specifically say, make it a number. Transform the string into a number. That's sometimes necessary. So I can basically say I'm going to change the type depending on my needs. Now what are basically, okay, so we already talked about integers. That is, so I can write this like that. I can, of course, as soon as I do it something else, this will not work, but this works. So why does this work? What's the difference between an int and a float? An integer is basically, if in very simple terms, a full natural number, and a float is basically something that works for decimals and has a particular kind of precision. This is super important, especially in JavaScript. JavaScript is really nasty with that kind of feature. But if you let me make you a simple example. So you would say, actually we're gonna leave it like that, and here say divided by 3. Right? It's just a normal mathematical operation. Let's do 101 here again. So what we see now is that this is 50 point and then a third, right? So in theory, this would go endlessly. It would go endlessly, but it doesn't because it only has a particular kind of precision, which basically means that in more complex calculations, I can be off. I can be off by a lot, and if I have really complex methods that I'm calculating, taxes over so and so many, whatever, I all of a sudden start losing money. Now you can influence precision from floats, but is a little bit too much for today. What I want you to remember is that so there are two things now. We have two integers, and the output of this whole operation though is a float, because these full numbers is divided by 3 is basically not a full number, as you see. It is a float. So we talked about strings, we talked about integers, we talked about floats. One more type that is probably very relevant is an array. And an array is also the most complex to understand if you are not familiar with what that is. So first of all, if you look at legacy code, you will basically see that you can also write it like this, right? This is also an array, which is a little bit confusing because it looks like a function, but it's actually it's sufficient to say, okay, an array is defined by hard brackets. Now, an array, in the most simplest terms, is something that you can look at as a indexed list. Okay, so let's just say I have something like Sam, and I have something like Tom, right? Then that's a particular list I have that consists of two values. One is Sam and one is Tom. Now, when I say indexed, what I mean is that under the hood, I can now basically set the pointer to a particular element. So let's say I want to do the first that starts with 0. And the output of that will be Sam, right? Because that is the first value. About that 0. Now, you will find that in any serious language, right? I mean, there are exceptions like MATLAB or whatever, but the reason for that has a lot to do with what's actually happening. So in reality, of course, this goes back to all of this gets translated to machine language, and when we say like, okay, so where do you want to start? Then the beginning would be 0, right? So if I were to print this, and actually let me do this. This is probably even better. Let's do the following. Let's say, okay, this is something you can for now ignore. I'm just going to do that so we see it better. And then we say print our array. Okay, so this should give us a little bit of a better feeling. So as you can see, this is the array that we're now actually looking at, how it's understood, right? So the value 0 would be Sam, and the value of 1 would be Tom. And this would in theory be the key. Okay, that's why I can do stuff like echo array, and let's say now 1. So this should do what? This should output Tom, right? And it does. See, now it says Tom. Now, there are a lot of functions that would allow you to access such arrays. So you basically say array find. Wait a second. Array. No, that's not a good example. What's the easiest example? What is the easiest example is let's do this one maybe. There's populous. No, there's so much. There's so much. Okay, if key exists. So let me just do that. Okay. So this now basically gets us a true or false, right? Oh, sorry, I need to say which. Sorry about that. This now, of course, needs to know which array. No, it doesn't print anything. Interesting. Oops. Come on. This does not echo anything. Huh. Okay, so it either does or not. Okay, interesting. Interesting behavior. You never echo that in reality. That's why I'm confused myself. Well, basically, here we can, for example, say, well, does the key 1 exist? And we know it does. It's actually Tom, right? And I can search arrays. I can do all kinds of things. I can move the pointer in iterations. I mean, there's so much to say about that, but none of that I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about is that I cannot echo this array, of course, right? So if I were just to say, like, please give me the array, then it would say, well, no, this doesn't really work, right? So the way we work on these arrays is it has to be a little bit different. So what we need to say about arrays is that PHP has the excellent capability, and that's one of the big advantages of this language. You will later notice how important arrays are. You can define your own indexes. So I can say first, and I can say second. Now what you will see, I can still not echo that. Let me put that away. What you can see now, instead of 0 and 1, it now has first and second. So all of a sudden, this does not start counting anymore. right? So if I were to say, okay, I can now say first, and it would give me Sam, and I could now say second, and it would give me Tom. And as you can see now, I write that as a string. So if I do this now and say, well, the first element, then this key doesn't really exist anymore, right? That's very interesting to note. However, let's do something strange and say, okay, we're going to do third now. And all of a sudden it displays third. Now why is that the case? As you can see, this is now mixed, right? So if I execute this, I will notice that, so this has a defined a key, right? So first and then Sam, second and then Tom. Third does not have a defined key, which means it must be a value, right? So now it starts and says, okay, so there's no key here, so I'm going to start with my 0. Do you see that? So that can be a little bit tricky. So that is now not, as you might have expected, index 2. It is actually 0. So basically now it starts counting well based on that. So if I basically were to move that over, you can see that probably nicer, and then basically say fourth, then what would happen is that this only counts if it does not have a key provided. Now, what can also be done, let's get rid of this ugly markup here, and to say like, well, so array could also have something like, let's say names. And so what you probably noticed now is that those are strings here. Those values are strings. So while the keys are always strings, this can be whatever type it needs to be. So I could also say, okay, this is Sam and Tom, right? And would basically then generate a deeper structure. So now there's an array in this array, right? Which gives me the possibility to say, okay, how would I access this? So array names, and then 0, and this should be Sam now. See that? Now that is very interesting, of course. So those are strings. Again, I can actually also say, okay, this has a float in there, right? I mean, I can basically have an array can have whatever type I want to. And just for clarity, I can also basically, don't want to go too much into style, but just so you see it nicer when it how it's structured, how deep it is basically. So those arrays are a little bit confusing to use, but output, let's quickly talk about that. We actually already did, but on a little bit of a higher level, what I'm now doing with echo, that is something that is very sloppy. So at the end of the day, we talked about like should this be in between PHP somewhere in HTML and so on. Like, we don't want that. What we actually want is the perfect setup would basically leave you with one single echo statement at the end of your code, right? So we're going to have like a bunch of files, and it all runs together, and at the very end you generate an echo and basically output it to the to the response of the request. So what happens in reality, of course, is if I go to network here. So what I'm doing here when I visit a particular page is I basically here have a get call. You can see this is the complete document on a particular port, in that case port 80, and or it could be 443 if you have an SSL certificate. And the answer to that request of the browser is, of course, the HTML document itself. So we see that response. So you can see that is the response, right? Here you go, down here. That is exactly what we're looking at. So that is basically what the echo does. It's going to write to that response. And that is, again, something we will only want to do at the very end. However, what we're now going to do is we're going to construct something before we output it in the first place. So let's jump back here and say, okay, so we going to start to think about loops. So there are 3 loops we want to talk about. The first one, and that's the one that's always taught first, but it's most confusing, is the for loop. So I want to start with the for each loop. So the for each markup is actually pretty simple. So I say for each, and then in that case array, and then I write as, and now I can basically decide whatever I want to. And I'm just going to say item for now. So what does this do? Let's get rid of this. This basically says, okay, so I'm going to go over this and iterate, which basically means I'm going to do this as often as I need to. So this array, this outer array, has 3 elements, right? So one would be names, next one would be first, next one would be second, right? This is basically, so this whatever happens in here happens 3 times. And item is the value of this, right? So if I, for example, say echo $item, then what I expect now to happen is that with the first time names, it will have a conversion problem because there's no value, there's an array here. But here, for Sam and Tom, it works. So let's do that, and let's add a line break here, and see what we get. Okay, so this is the first one is our problem. See, it's an array, it's not a value. And then we have Sam and Tom, so it works with those 2. See that? Now, in PHP, what I can also do, so again, this item, just to be clear, right, that would now be a way for us to go over those and say, okay, so this, the first time, so this value would be, the second time it would be Sam, third time would be Tom, and the first time it would basically fail and say, yeah, this is not a string. I can't echo that. And in PHP, you have this cool ability, and it's a little bit easier in PHP than with others, to say, actually, give me the key and item, right? So what I have now is the possibility to say, this variable can now read the key itself. And this would still remain the same, so this still is has the same output. So if I do this, everything stays the same. But if I, for example, say, okay, so please echo the key, and again, this is how we concatenate strings, and say like, okay, give me this string. So this string, add this string, which is, just a colon, and add this string, and this, of course. Then this is the output that we get, right? It's okay, names, okay, that's a problem, it's an array. Then first, that's the key, is Sam, and second is Tom. So as you can see, we can basically start to generate a little bit of a more complex scenario here and create tables and so on. Now, that will basically be that kind of loop. What we can do is, that's probably something we should look into, what happens if we do the following. And that's a little bit of a brain game here. So let's go back to printing that, right? Print our array. Now, what if I say, okay, what I'm going to do here additionally is to say item, and I just amend a exclamation mark, right? So this, oh wait, right to string conversion, why does this happen twice? Oh, because it happens twice, okay. Actually, this bothers me a little bit. Let's, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to comment this out for now. Okay. So I basically change item, right? So, but for some reason I do not see the exclamation mark here, and I do not see the exclamation mark here. And this is something that is really interesting to understand, that, you know, if things work by reference, or the actual representation, this will become very important to understand later. So I do not touch the item here of the array here in reality. So I cannot make any kind of changes to item and key and expect that to change the array. So if, on the other hand, so I now know, okay, the key, I iterate through the keys and I iterate through the items. So if I were to say, okay, so the array key, then what I do get in the output is I get the exclamation mark. So now I'm writing directly on the array. Right? Is this understandable? It's probably a little bit complicated at the beginning. But what's actually happening is, okay, so the key, first time I'm going over it, would have first, right? So now I'm basically getting the value of array, and I'm assigning it, or basically amending to the already existing assignment of Sam, the exclamation mark. So this is basically the shortest form. Let me get rid of that one. To work with something which values I either don't know or I don't want to do by hand. So this is equal to saying array first equals this, oops, sorry, and array second, right? So I'm doing this, what I'm doing here is exactly the same as this. However, in this scenario, I need to know that information, which might not be the case. So if we're going to later start abstracting, and we'll notice that we actually never know this normally. We can account for a couple of cases, but we never, we want to work with data without knowing, well, you know, what is the key? So this would basically free me from that. So whatever I'm doing, so let's just say I'm going to, let me comment that back in, and comment that back out. And now I basically say, okay, I'm going to make changes to the array, fundamental changes to the array, and say, okay, this is now, I don't know, Harris and George. Okay, so what would happen, and we will basically see that, here undefined index first, undefined index second, right? So here it's 0 Harris, this is our array now, 0 Harris and 1 George, and then first exclamation mark and second exclamation mark. Okay, why is that happening? Well, so in reality, this one, if I ignore that, this would still work fine, right? We have changed this, so now the key would be 0 in the first with Harris and 1 with George, so it works just like a charm. Now here, the error that we're getting, if I do this the other way around and say this is not executed, but this is, we get those notices. Now it's a notice, right? It doesn't fail. So why doesn't it fail? Well, because the only issue it has is that I'm amending it. So if I were to do it like this, then it would work like a charm, right? And even though it's complaining, it still actually works like a charm. So it's just not doing what I want to do. So instead of getting the exclamation point, amended to the existing values of the array, I now have like two. I assign it basically, right? This is okay. Now I have first is now a new key, and second is now a new key. So now my array has 4 elements all of a sudden, right? But in this scenario, there are only 2 elements, and you can see, and it works like a charm. I can simply amend to this value. So that's a for each loop. And now for completion, let's basically say, and actually I'm going to leave that here and just comment it out, because the next thing that we're going to do is to have a for loop. Okay, so for loop is a little bit confusing. And why, or actually, sorry, let's just say 5. Yeah, that's what we're gonna do. Why am I doing this today? Okay. Okay. Now, what, actually, let's add a line break here. Okay, so what's happening here? This is basically the output that we're seeing right here now. Let's actually ignore that one as well. So what a for loop does is it basically does everything at once. So first of all, and this should look natural, I define $I, so I define a variable and set it to the integer 0. Set it to 0, right? This is common, by the way. You will see that also in many languages. So that's normally used for an iterator, hence the I. Set it to 0, and then you can see I used the semicolon, so it's the end of that particular command. The next command is a condition, which basically means, okay, so as long as $I, so the value of $I, is smaller than 5. Okay, end of command. And the last one is, well, what basically happens for every iteration. Well, please add, so this is, we haven't talked about this, but this is actually a short form. I could also write this as $I, let me quickly write it here. I could also write this as $I equals $I plus 1, right? This is, I can write this shorter and basically say, no, just add 1, right? Also quite common in most languages. So what happens is I'm iterating over here. So first it's 0, and I echo that. That's correct. Then it happens again. Now it's 1 because this has happened, right? And this goes on until it wants to hit 5, which it doesn't work because it needs to be smaller than 5, right? So I still have 5 values here, as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because we start with 0, right? I mean, we could basically also start with that. That's a common mistake that people make, is that they say, okay, so now I only have 4 values, right? So it's 1 to 4. So if I wanted to have it till 5, I can either do smaller equals 5, right? Or, of course, smaller 6 to get to my 5 values, right? So that's a pretty common way of doing things. And then I can now, of course, I can completely ignore this pattern and say, well, couldn't I do this in here, right? So if I say I0, can I not say, let's say I only want to do this once, for example, right? Can I not say, so this array has now 2, right? So this is again the output of, oh, I don't have that one anymore. I have no output, right? So this goes basically amends this one. So what if I want to say this should only happen to the first one? I can of course say, well, if I equals 0, and in here I'm going to write the I++. So we're a little bit ahead of ourselves, but just to understand what's happening now. So this is a little bit the same, right? I can, of course, just put that into a for each and basically do that myself and iterate over it based on that. So now as soon as this if isn't true anymore, this does not get executed. We're going to get to conditionals in the next one, right? Yes, but let's finish the while loop first, though. So what do we have here? Well, pretty straightforward. Now it only happens to the first one. See, here the exclamation mark is amended. Here it isn't. Okay, so the last loop that we have is the while loop. The while loop is dangerous and powerful. The while loop basically has a condition that I place in here. So I can, of course, do it like this. That's probably the easiest form of doing it. Again, let's ignore that one. And here I basically say, well, I smaller 5, I plus plus, echo $I, and you will see now how it changes the infrastructure a little bit. So what I have now is, again, let's have this a little bit more visual here. Sorry, I mean, again, this is normally not how you would write it. So now I have 5 values. Do you see that? Now I can control this because, so in reality, this runs 6 times. Why does it run 6 times? Well, so no, sorry, it's not this run 6 times. But before I before this is evaluated, it is already set to 5, right? So I have I plus plus, so let's say it's 0. So now it's 0, is smaller than 5. Yes, we're in here. Now I set it to 1, right? I add 1, and now I echo it, so here's the output of 1. And next time it has 1, it's still smaller than 5. I set it to 2, and so on. So if I were to change the order of this, I have the little bit more familiar output here, right? We say like, okay, it's 0 till 4. Now, why would you use the while loop? So the while loop is extremely dangerous. Again, if this does not go false, so if this is always a condition that is true, then it's going to basically be a huge issue because it's just simply going to keep running. That is sometimes what you want to do. Because sometimes you work with something that is not immediately accessible, right? This but with file reading, you see that a lot. That a while is used, or with when you basically receive a stream from like a database layer or whatever. So that is basically when you would use a while. So as long as this condition is true, this happens, right? Yes, so those are basically the 3 loops I want to talk about. And of course, like with anything, you can basically always stack it, right? So I can of course do another for each in here now if I wanted to, which I'm not going to do, but I mean everything basically goes on forever. Now we have loops, we have conditions and operators. So we already have seen a couple of things that are interesting for us. So the first, an easy condition that, let me actually be brutal here and do the following. I'm going to have an if, and here I'm going to say echo yes. Okay. So true is true. Okay, let's talk about this. So conditions are best to be understood as a way of evaluating particular things. So at the end of the day, something is either true or falsy, which basically means that we will have to learn what is true and what is false, right? So this is first of all how the markup is if I can do, you know what we're going to do? Just a basic if else is probably something we want to start with. Then we're going to say echo no. Okay. So an if would be one of the most common conditions where we say, okay, if, and actually, you know what, we're also going to say else if is null. Oops. There you go. Let's be a little bit tricky here. Okay. Now, so if, and then here we place our condition, and then again, okay, everything that happens in here, let me actually clean this up a little bit, and maybe talk about this first scenario here. Everything that's between those curly braces would then basically be executed if this is true. Else if is something, okay, so I'm going to, so I'm already in the else basically, right? So now basically this is not true. Well, but maybe it is null, right? In that case, I want to have the maybe. Let's actually do that. Right, now I get the maybe. Null is a type we haven't talked about. It's basically a little bit of the realm of everything. And now that is true, so now I get the maybe, right? And if I say something like 0, I get no. So why is that the case, right? So again, at the end, everything is either true or false. So what is interpreted as true is relatively simple. Like either it actually evaluates to true. So if I, for example, say 1, I get yes, right? That has a lot to do with, at the end of the day, everything are zeros and ones. So I can have, for example, in the most easiest case, I can basically simply define this and say, yes, this is true. I can also say it is a string. Hi. It's still yes, right? This is true. So a string apparently evaluates to true. If I have a string with no, it is still yes. If I have a string with false, it is still yes. If I, of course, have false, whoops, then I have no. Now, what is, how do you evaluate that true or false? Well, normally with operators, right? I would not normally like use a particular kind of, I mean, that would be very descriptive. Why would I do that? So I would have to look into operators. But before we do that, if is of course not the only form of condition you can have, but it's the most common one. And at the end of the day, with if and else, you can do everything. That's why I'm kind of going to leave it here. There's also switch case, which makes things a little bit easier. But an if is actually something that is sufficient to produce everything you need to do. Now, let's jump into operators. So if I say true equals, and then here I'm going to have an expression that will be either true or false. So if I say 1 equals 1, well, why don't you like that? It's the same operand. Yeah, I know that. You don't like that, huh? Why don't you like that? It's the same operands. Yeah, I know that. Okay, flip. Yeah, it's just because it's nonsensical. So what I'm doing here, you can see I use 2 equal signs, and that would compare basically the left and the right here. I might as well just write this directly in here if I wanted to. Right, this would work just as fine. Right, we're just not going to do that for simplicity reasons here. So in JavaScript, it will be also very important to understand that there's a difference between 2 and 3 equal signs. So 2 equal signs basically compares something on a particular level. So here, as you can see, this is still true. This is still the same. So the number 1 is the same as the string 1. Now that is awkward, right? It's a very strange behavior. But if I add another equal sign, it will also say like, yeah, but does it also have the same type? And you will see it is no. But if I were to say, yeah, but 1, then it would say yes. So what I'm generating with 2 or 3 is basically just the question of, well, is it just the same value, or is it also the same type, right? So this can become very, very important to understand the difference. So what do we have as well? We of course can say like, well, is it greater than 1? Is 1 greater than 1? And the answer is of course no. Well, is it greater or equal? And the answer is of course true. Yes, it is. It's not greater, but it is equal. And same goes of course the other way around. How about smaller? This is true, and this is of course not true, right? So this is basically how we can basically handle ourselves around with particular operators, and those are most of the time you can simply take them from mathematics, right? So other than the equal, it would probably not make any kind of difference. Now, to understand how a condition works is, well, I mean, we already said a string is true. So, which basically means that everything that returns a true as a function is also interpreted like that, right? So, if I say something like, okay, is array, which is a function that determines whether or not something is an array, and now I'm going to place an empty array in there, right? Then it will say yes, right? I can also say, okay, Sam, Tom, right? This will say yes. But if I, for example, say is numeric, right? It will say no, because this array is not numeric. It's an array. So those are onboard functions. We don't need to know those right now, but it's interesting or native functions is actually what they're saying. But it's interesting to understand that at the end of the day, all of those can be evaluated and basically say, well, is it true or is it not true? So that is why when you look at php.net, if this ever works, and just look into any, I don't know, account values, yeah, sure, why not, or error diff, it really doesn't matter. Then it will basically always give you the return values, right? So this returns an array, right, for example, and every function returns a particular thing, or it's void, in which case it doesn't return anything. But and all of that could basically be also interpreted with whether or not something is true. So in the easiest way, if I say true is an array, and then say if array, then the output of that will be yes, right? Because an array is still true. This is true. It has a value. It is not zero. It is not null. It is not false. Like, this is true. And what constitutes true and what constitutes false is something that, especially in the realm of JavaScript, you can read books about, because people are often mistaken in their expectations of what they expect to happen in certain scenarios. Now, that said, the operators that we want to talk about, I think we went through the most important ones of them. What I should tell you is something that you will see sometimes. I'm going to actually do this, and this looks very strange at the beginning. So you will often see this form of writing. This is also quite similar to JavaScript, right? So what this does, and by the way, this is just yes, no. This is a very shorthand form of writing an if statement. So this does nothing else to say like, well, so if this, then yes, else no, right? And you can see in that case it's yes. So that is basically something that I do not recommend to do that at the beginning. It will make sense after a while to use such operations, but this makes more sense for you right now because it's easier to understand and easier to grasp. And we should start with functions first, right? We should switch this around. I'm running out of voice here, as I don't know if you can hear that. So I'm going to take a short break and get back to you soon. Okay. Sorry. A lot of talking today. So, where have we been? So the conditions and operators. Okay, so we basically went over that. Now, the include, autoload, and namespaces, we basically have to divide that up a little bit more logical. So let's first go with an include here, right? So let me do the following and say I'm going to have a new file that I'm going to call include. Okay, so in this include file, I'm simply going to echo hello world for now. Okay, so in my index file, what I'm going to do, I have a couple of possibilities. Again, I'm here, right? So here I'm still with yes. Let's get rid of all of this for now and say, okay, so I can include files in order to basically read them and execute them and so on. So if I say include and then, oops, as a string, include PHP, what will happen is, as you can see, that now I have included this file, so I get the hello world, right? So this could, for example, now be something like, okay, I have header and a footer that I include. And so I don't write this here. Now it basically takes exactly this file away here, right? Now there's a difference between include and then there's also an include once, right? And the big difference, okay, give me a second. Okay, sorry, somebody called me. So, where have we been? Yes, so the include PHP, I can include that once. Now, the reason why I add those once things is that should my code be complex and I include a file more often, so let's just do that. So I run this, then it's only included once. However, if I were to not do this, right, I can see it's included twice. So that's the reason why in most cases you want to have an include once to prevent it from happening again. So what is interesting though is if I do this, then it will still basically work because so here I include it regardless of whether or not it's been included before or not, right? That's pretty interesting to note. I mean, this will be something that you basically will see in a more complex scenario where that's a huge difference. Now, there's also a require and require once, right? So the big difference here is when we later talk about classes and whatsoever, is when to use an include and when to use a require. We will require files in most of the time because we will normally not include stuff like that. We will actually get to that in a second, I guess, right? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So now we're basically going to jump over to functions and classes before we do the autoloaded namespaces. So it makes more sense for our natural progression of things. Now, That said, let's start with a function. Okay, so we have had very basic markups, but when we talk about coding, what we actually want to do is we want to generate reusability. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to generate a function. Okay, so the most basic function that we want to do is let's call that add1. Add1, and here we basically have number. Okay, so and here we basically say return number plus plus. Okay, now the return statement is something that is basically we haven't introduced it yet. It only makes sense in the context of a function, but you do remember that we said there's only going to be one echo statement at the end of our actual code. So in reality, what we do most of the times is we're going to return something. Okay, so we have this function now. It's called add1, and since we included the include PHP in this, what we can do now is basically we're going to say echo add1 5. So our expected output now is 6. Oops. This is probably because we have this written so small. So that's by reference. Let's actually talk about this for a second too. So we can basically put in something by number. Let me actually show you what the difference is. Okay, so let's just say here I'm going to say number is 5, right? And then I'm going to do something as add1, and I'm going to say, whoops, number. Sorry, this needs to be here. And then we say number plus plus. We don't need a return in that case. Now it's void. And here we basically going to say echo number. So let's talk about inheritance here too. Okay, so why does this work? So there are two ways that we can basically operate, right? So we can basically pass in something by reference, which you can see this. This is what my editor does. This is not how I write it. And but here I basically say, okay, take this variable and change this variable directly. Right, so I do something to the number. This does not return anything here now. The function, it just changes the passed-in variable, and basically now the number is all of a sudden changed, right? So in a more classical sense, though, I would basically return a number plus 1. Whoops. Now, the effect of that is that if I run this now, it's going to say 5, right? Why is it going to say 5? Well, because we're not doing anything with this, right? So I can basically now say new number, and then it's going to say 6. So why is that happening? So here I pass in 5, and this function returns the new value. So in that case, we add this 5, then plus 1, so it returns 6 in this scenario, right? Or let's just say we want to have 9, and then it returns 10, right? So there are a couple of things to say to that. So this function now basically returns, which means it assigns to the new number. So new number is basically now the result of this add1, right? We can also be very strict about things. So let's just say I place this in a string. So this, as we talked before, like PHP is very easy on typing. So this is a string, but since we're using a mathematical operator here, the plus, this is now interpreted as a number. Now, sometimes this is a very dangerous game, and with more modern PHP versions, we can type things. So there are a couple of things I can do. So on the level of my editor, what I want to do is I can basically say, okay, so the parameter that comes in must be an integer, right? At which point, when I start writing it, that's actually not even bitching, because it's not a class. Interesting. It'll still work. This should okay. Yeah, I expected more of my IDE. But if I want to have a type number, then what I'm going to do here is to say, okay, this is. Why doesn't this work? I have the wrong. I know why. Hold on. This is something completely other than you'd expect. So the come on. Okay. Yeah, I have no interpreter. So let's do it like this. Set this up to something above 7.3. Okay. So what happens now? No, it still doesn't bitch. That's very interesting. Very interesting. I actually expected it to bitch now, which apparently doesn't. But it's probably just because of the way we include it. We're too primitive here at this level. Very interesting. Okay. Well, let's jump back to that topic actually when we're starting with classes. Then it makes probably more sense. So ignore that for now. So how does a function look like in general? Well, so the function keyword is something I use. Then I can name it. So add one would be a method, and then basically I drop in the parameters that I can basically name however I want to. Now, if I do something like I don't have the right kind of parameters, I can basically see it's expecting something, right? This is like a little bit of a weird warning, but here required parameter missing. So this already indicates that no, something is wrong. If I execute this now, it's actually going to really crash. So this is something, even if I don't have this, this is basically simply not going to work. I will actually crash the application. It will throw a fatal error and fail to execute. So I need this. What I can do in PHP, and that's actually pretty cool, is I can also say like, okay, I give this a default value, right? So if I execute it now, it's going to say 6 because the number defaults to 5. So if I don't provide a particular form of information here, it's just going to default. Of course, as soon as I put in the number, it's going to work correctly. And there are multiple cases where I want to do that. So, and I can separate that by comma, right? So let's just say we're going to create another function, and we're going to call this function sum of, and then we're going to say number 1, number 2. This is a very primitive example, but it doesn't matter. And we're going to say, okay, return number 2 plus number 1. And actually, I can think of scenarios where we don't want that. If we talk negatives and stuff, so we want to do it in the right order. So now I can say, okay, sum of, and then I say number and 3. And what will happen is it's going to add 3 to the number that we provided, which has 9.5, right? So that's what I'm basically going to return here. And again, I can have as many, and now let's basically, so cannot fail. We would now, for example, say, oh yes, and they both default to 0. Okay, so if that's not the case, let's say I only pass in one value, then it's not 9.5, right? Because what happens here is that I don't have any kind of second parameter. So the first parameter again is number 1, but the second one then defaults to 0, and it still works fine. What else is there to say about functions? Okay, so now with very modern, actually PHP 7.4 has also a different form of writing functions. That would be like a closure, and I'm actually going to write that right here. So what I can also do is to say, and I'm not actually sure how that, if I can do that directly, and that returns directly, so 5. This is written like that. I don't even know how. I don't even know how. You know what? Let's Google that together quickly because I don't use that. PHP 7.4 short functions. Error functions. Yeah, so it must be with an error function. FN. Okay. So this does work like that. And post ID. Yeah, no, this should work. This should work, right? I'm not sure why it doesn't. Tostrings not implemented for closure. Why would you need a tostring? Okay. Is this how it works? This should work. No. Oh, I don't need the. Got it. This. Don't have to. Just curious. Plus closure could not be converted to string. Let's figure this out some other time. This completely new stuff. Let's stick with you know, the regular implementation. So we already said that what we can do, and we will see that in classes, is we can type all of this. So we can basically say this is an integer, or int probably. Yep. This is an int, and this is also an int. And what we could also say, is that we can say what's the return value. So if I do this, then now basically it's going to say nope, this is not correct. It's expected to be void, but it's not. So I'm going to say this always returns an int. So what I've done now is basically I have typed this sum function. So now it will understand that, okay, so this takes two integer values and it returns an integer value. And that's basically how it can operate on that level. Now, the more interesting thing, though, is to say, okay, so how do I generate an object, right? And that is basically something that's a bit more interesting. And by the way, see that it's now basically returning an int rather than 9.5, because this is a float. You remember that. But what we can do is, of course, say like, okay, we want to kind of package this whole thing a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class. I'm going to say class calculator, and I'm going to place mine. Let's ignore this for now. Oops. I'm going to place my functions in here. Now this is a vastly different behavior now. So as you will see, this does not exist anymore, right? So what we have instead is that we generated a class, and this class basically now defines what kind of methods it has. So it's still a function in the class, but we now call it methods because if I have a calculator, actually let's do this. Let's now say, okay, we're going to use this now. We're going to use this class and going to say, okay, calculator is new. Oh, how do we call this? Let's name this nicely. Is new calculator. Okay, so when I now say calculator sum of, it will still work nicely, right? So why classes and what's with inheritance? Let me just see if this is something that we basically do, inheritance. Yep, okay. So I can now generate what is called an instance of the calculator. So let's just assume that we change our structure a little bit. So again, I can have methods in in my class, but I can also have properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a public public variable number. Okay, I'm going to do that. Not sure why. Missing properties, type declaration. Let's fix that. Okay, interesting that you see it that way. Interesting. Now, it's actually not required. I don't know why he does that. Anyway, so I have now basically defined this number. So what does this do? Well, it's pretty simple. It's let's get rid of all of this. So I have this new instance of the calculator. Now, when I now say, okay, give me calculator number, then that is 0. Now, what I can do now is say, okay, so in reality, what I pass in here does not really return anything, but rather change what our running number is. So let's try this out. Let's get rid of this. And here, what we're saying here is that we say this number, and we should probably, we should probably do something else here. We're going to call this result, just so it's not confusing. Okay. And we're going to do the same here. Okay. And actually what we're doing here is we're going to say we're going to do it like this. Sum of, okay, this we're going to leave the same. And I actually want to put this down here so we can see this easier. So this is our class, this is how we use it. So of course number now doesn't exist anymore, it's now called result. Right, so this is still 0. So if I now basically say calculator, and you can see add 1, so what happens now is I get a 1 here. Why is this happening? Well, so this calculator basically is an instance of this class, and now I execute add 1, which basically means, okay, the result, which is 0, is now is now added by 1, right? So, which basically means that if I ask for a result, which I can access by this basically means like in the context of where I am. So in that case, in the context of this class. So for us outside, wherever we assign it to, so to calculator. So calculator result is now 1, right? So if I create another instance of it, and now let's basically say, okay, calculator 2 is new calculator. And what I'm also echoing here is, let me put this in between here. Okay. And if I say, okay, calculator 2 result, then there's something I see. So this is a completely different instance. What we have done here did happen to calculator, so to the instance of calculator, not to the instance of calculator 2. So those are two completely separate entities. We're just reusing this code, right? So here it's still 0 on the calculator 2, but calculator 1 or calculator has a value of 1. The next thing that we can do is, of course, to say, okay, so what happens if a new calculator is created? Okay, so let's create a special function. It's going to call the construct, and we are start value is 0, and then we're going to say this result is start value. And here we don't have to declare it anymore, just so we don't have any kind of redundancies. Okay. So what this means now, this will change nothing for us here, right? This is still the same. But what is the constructor? The constructor is basically a function that gets executed when we create a new instance of this class. So if I were to say like, okay, my starting value is 5, I just pass that in here. See, now it's a start value. And what that does is that now this is 6, because 5 was my starting value. So calculator now is set to 5. See that? Result is set to 5. And then we run let's ignore that one for now. Then we run the calculator add 1. So now, add 1 so it adds 1 to 5, right? And then we basically exclude get the result, and we get this 6 out, right? So that's a very primitive example. So as you can see, I called this public, and this, even though it's not called anything, is in reality a public function, and this is in reality also a public function, right? And this is in reality also a public function because it defaults to that. However, I could set this to private. So when I set this to private, you see it starts bitching immediately, and if I try to execute it, it'll say, nope, this doesn't work, because from outside of this class I cannot access this method. It's a private function, so it can only be done internally. And this is something that I do a lot to protect. Oh no, sorry. Let's not start with protected. But to save my my code from any kind of outside interference. So in a very classical sense, what you would see a lot is that this is set to private, right? So this is a runner that you want to set to private. Why do you want to set it to private? Well, because if I have it public, let's say I have it public. So this should now work, right? What I could in theory do is I can say, okay, so calculator result plus plus. So what happens now is that this is 7, because this is a public property, and I can of course play around with it outside of the actual class. And this can be very dangerous depending on the use case. Like, no, I don't want this to happen. So it's quite common that, like what I'm using here would be private. As you can see now, this will fail here. And then what I have instead is a public function, get result, right? Where we basically say, okay, return this result. Okay, there's also two-string. Let's keep it simple. So this will now not work, right? So what happens is I produce an error, right? This is nope, you cannot do this, and this I can also not do, right? I cannot echo this. This will simply not work. But what I can do instead is I can basically say, okay, get result, and same here. So execute these methods, and then everything works fine. So I have now basically prevented any kind of meddling with my result from the outside. I have to use the methods provided here, and in order to basically change anything. And that is basically how we want to do it. There's protected when it comes to well, yeah, we have to talk about extend, I suppose. Yeah, let's do that. So there's when we chain functionality in object-oriented programming, what we would do is that sometimes the calculator is used by something. We talked about like how you abstract things. So let's actually say the following. So the first thing that we want to do is probably going to start refactoring the include. So this is now going to be called calculator, and let's do that. Okay, class calculator, and here this doesn't exist anymore. Okay, right. Perfect. And the next thing that we want to do is we want to create something else, and we're going to call this, what are we going to call it? Oh, I really don't know. I'm just going to call it test for now. So what we can do here, we still have no namespace, so I'm going to require once the calculator. And what I'm going to do here then is to say, okay, this extends the calculator. Okay, so what can I do now? So this, I now generated a wrapper, right? I generated a new class. So here, instead of the calculator, I am going to include test, right? Now, as you can see, this still works, right? This works because we're inheriting basically the requires. So this requires test, and test requires the calculator. So I can still access the calculator. It's a little bit unclean, but it works. But what if, instead of new calculator, let's actually get rid of the second instance here so we don't get confused. So instead of new calculator, I'm going to do test. Does this still work? And as you can see, it still works. Now, why does this work? So our test extends the calculator, which basically means that this wraps itself around the calculator. So now we can exclude all of this. So if I were to say, let's do this for example, and I say, let's say public function construct, then, okay, this is what my IDE does, but that's interesting. Then now I can basically say, okay, this executes the construct of the parent, which basically means like, okay, now I'm executing the what I require in order to get this started. So if I'm not doing this, what happens now, right? I mean, it's probably going to bitch. Yeah, it's going to bitch. So I don't have a result, right? Result must not be accessed before initialization. So why is this happening? Well, because this result has not a value, right? So if let's actually play around with the calculator here, just so you get an understanding for it. So now it's actually 1. So what happens in my actual index is that this is not passed on anymore. I've overwritten the constructor of calculator because I'm executing test. So I'm overriding that. And I'm not doing the parent. So right now I'm doing the parent again. So everything works as I expect. Now what I could do here, of course, is I can have functionality. Let's just say start value plus 4. Let's be weird. And so now I add 4 to the start value. So what I get now is 10, which basically means whenever I'm using test instead of the calculator, my start value is more or less skewed by 4, and I add 4 to whatever's inputted here, right? So I basically have, that kind of behavior. I mean, I can, for example, make this a little bit logical now and basically say, like, I'm going to say if start value smaller 0, then start value is 0. Okay, very simple form of writing that. And that, for example, is because, well, in test, I don't allow the start value to be negative, right? So here, everything would simply work as expected. But if I were to do -5, then it would say, nope, you're starting from 0. Okay, so talking about inheritance, what I can do now in here is, of course, I can now say, and this might be interesting, I can now say this sum of. Why can I do that? Well, because I'm extending the calculator, so I can use every function that is present here, right? So sum of is something I can simply use in my test, and it will work. So if I here do add 1, right, it will work like a charm, and basically execute the add 1 function directly while constructing. Now what I can also do is I can extend. So I can also say, okay, public function, do this. Okay, so what I have now generated is basically the capability to say, okay, here I can simply use all the methods that I have from the inherited calculator, and additionally I have do this at my disposal, which is something that does not exist in the calculator, but it does exist in the test PHP. Now that is pretty simple to understand, but now let's get a little bit interesting here and say, okay, I'm gonna create the function with the same name, and we'll say return boo boo. Okay. So what happens in this scenario? Oh, actually, why is this happening in this scenario? Oh, because we're not. Okay, got it. So, okay. Hold on. The add 1 plus 7. Okay. So I have now basically, since we're executing test, this is the function that should actually happen. Right? So what happens is I given 5, the add 1 executes. The add 1 does not touch the get result though. It actually directly returns. Right? So I can now basically say, if I were to echo this and say add 1, then I get boo boo 5. So now the add1 does something else, right? It does not execute add1 from the parent. I mean, again, I can, of course, say, okay, sure, do both of that, right? Do the add1, and in that case, I should probably specify and say parent add1. But we would also have to talk about static, so let's ignore that for now. And or I can basically just overwrite that. However, if I now would say, okay, this is protected, then for whatever reason still executes. Whoa. Where do you get my... You don't warn me about it. Okay. I was hoping that it would warn me about that, but that's fine. Then we have to go to implements. Let's not do that. So overriding that is basically something that that I can do. So I can add to it, I can override it, and I can extend. So basically, just create functions that don't exist in the actual class. So what you normally do is, I know it's called extend, but what you normally do is that you have something that wraps, that uses different functions, right? So classically, you would find in a class a couple of, hey, use new so-and-so, use new so-and-so. There's just one more thing that we need to talk about when it comes to classes, is what you see here is an instance-based, so a class-based, an object-based notation. So calculator now is basically a test. But what this could be is this could basically also be static. So let's do this scenario where we say, okay, so we, for example, say static function. Oh, why does a bitch here? Cannot make non-static method. Cannot override it like that. Static function another, and then return boo boo. So what does this do? Jesus, that's slow. Call to protect method. Here we go. No, it does do it. It just doesn't warn. This is weird. Okay. This is weird. Then what we can do, and you can see this doesn't work now. This is ignored. No, this should work. Why doesn't this work? Void method. Oh, because we're echoing it. Okay. This works fine. It doesn't echo anything, of course. Well, where were we? Yes, so we have now another function. So instead of having a new instance, we talked about this with calculator 2 and so on. What I can also do is to say, okay, so there is test another, right? That works. So I have the double colon, and then I basically execute this function statically and say, okay, there's no $calculator I have it assigned to. There's no instance that I handle from here. I'm directly executing a method statically on test, right? It will be that one, and that's basically then what happens. And there's basically only one instance, if you want, so of this test. So if I do that, then the notation is a bit different. So here's the class, right? And then you see a double colon, and then here is the method. And in theory, this also works with variables. We could, for example, say like static test equals sum. I don't know why it requires that. It's very bitchy. So I could also say, no, what was it called again? Test, yep. Test. Sorry. Test, and then we basically get the sum out. See that? And the big difference in the internal reference is that since we don't have a this, what we have instead of it is a self. So what I can also do is say, okay, self test, right, is another. So if I here say another, get the same output. Right, so this now basically reference test, return self. So in my own context, test. Yeah, that's basically how it works. There is now the big topic of, well, so how do we require things and so on, right? And we can see this actually in the, what did I install here? Probably the ops. Okay, got it. There's one more thing that we don't want to look at actually. No, I'm going to write this way easier. That would basically be a little bit too much now. So we talked about autoload namespaces. Let's start with how things get loaded basically instead of the require ones. But we need a little bit of a project for that. So let's start with templating maybe, huh? So templating is something that is a very common task, right? Let's be brutal again and say we don't need any of this. So what we do need though sometimes is to say like, well, we have a particular format, and you can actually see that right here in the, we can go to PHP. It's actually very nice to see. So what have I done here? So what you see here is that I have my require once, and I have the vendor autoload PHP, which is something that Composer already automatically generates for me, and that would basically generate something based on namespaces, right? So here you can see what this is effectively is that there's a particular class that, and I can actually let me do this differently, so we at least have a little bit of a little bit of an introduction here. So this is basically a namespace that provides a particular logic of how things are loaded. So what this would do is that in the Neon 3 ops PHP, this is what is loaded. You can actually see that here in the, where is the PSR4? Here, where I basically tell, actually this is also way too complicated. In the long term, basically, that there's something that Neon 3 apps as a namespace, and ops is then a particular loading logic that would allow now me to use just ops to reference to a particular class that is somewhere completely different in the file system, right? And again, how that works is something that we have to go into detail, but just as a small introduction here. So I don't need to require this. I could, of course, instead of using this and somewhere in my code require the autoload, require every file I ever need in a long list of includes or whatever. But if I have any kind of autoload, it would allow me to basically just reference what I'm using accordingly. So what this does is embrace from file, so it uses templates, topics, HTML. Let's have a look at that and close actually all others. So templates, topics. What I see here is a regular HTML template, right? So here's a doc type declaration and so on. PHP, see that's what it says here. And then we have something that looks a little bit strange to us. So here it would have one list item in all the URLs, but for some reason it generates more of that. Well, the reason is that, and this is how you would often work, so this would also normally come from a database maybe. The reason is that we have an array here, and the array has very simple values, as you see, right? Variables, output, echo loops, and so on and so on. This is exactly what we're seeing here. Now, what I'm doing with templating, and basically, I mean, it looks different, but basically what you see is this is the class, and then statically I call the method. So there's a method embrace from file, and here's a location, so I pass that in based on particular rules. And then I pass in an array, and in that case it's an array with topics that includes the topics array itself. Right? So whatever happens here apparently reads this file and applies logic based on what I pass in here. Now, if you look at this and then remember the for each, you will notice that it's basically the same. Imagine instead of n4, it would say for each topics as topic. See that? So we're iterating over this and say, okay, so as long as we have topics, I'm going to use this value topic and repeat this whole scenario here, so this whole thing. And then basically have this particular markup here, the double curly braces. That's just something that's how this particular engine works. And so this is basically here a echo topic, right? I write it like that. And that is why I have the output for every single time. So this goes over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those and generates the LIs for it. So if I were to look at it, I would see I have all of those because this complete element is repeated. And you should remember this because this is also very common in JavaScript frameworks to operate like that. Right? It's basically how it would work. Yeah. That is one scenario to do it, and you will have a lot of different templating engines, but let's actually try to break it down. So what we want to do, let's make this easier, right? And say, let's go back to our index PHP. Go over here. It's empty now. So what we want to do is we want to have a particular template. So let's, for example, say we create a template, and the template is an HTML file, and we say, okay, this is our header, right? And in our header, we basically say, okay, I don't know. Let's actually make this pretty primitive and say there's a nav, and here the header. Let's keep this primitive. And then we also have a footer. And that's more or less the same. And there's a diff. Here the footer. Okay. And this is basically the stuff that we want to include. And then we maybe have a third one. Oh no, let's actually keep it like that. Let's keep it very simple for understanding purposes. So what I can now do is I can basically say, okay, let's use what we have learned so far. So I'm going to say, okay, header is, and I want to have this as a string, file get contents, and I'm going to say templates. Actually, let's be careful of where we are. Templates header. Okay. So file get contents is an easy form to access the file reader. So that's a native function, And we're going to pass in a file name, so a location if you want so, of the file that we want the file reader to read, and assign that to $header. So as you can see, I'm using this underscore underscore directory underscore underscore. This puts that in relation. So we have talked about relation a little bit in HTML. What is important for us to understand here is that the context of where we are is of course relevant. So this is the directory I'm in. So here is basically this where I am. PHP can of course access, depending on where I'm run, various folder structures, and it can basically go beyond myself and go out and you know, like go into HTML or whatever, depending on the rights I have on the file system. So what I want to do is like, okay, so from here, from where we are, I want to access templates, and in templates I want to access footer and HTML, header and footer. Now the reason why you don't see that normally has a lot of reasons. Here you also don't see it, but I do define a path here. But so in theory you can work relative, and as long as you're working with the container solution like Docker or whatever, that'll be fine. But if you want to basically say, hey, you know, I want to be very agnostic of where this runs and so on, I would recommend you to always use the absolute paths. So basically understand where you are and navigate accordingly. Because you can get out of there, like for example, I could do stuff like dir name, and this would now mean, okay, the directory of the directory I'm in. So now I'd be outside of video, not being HTML, right? And can basically hand my site out like that. But again, that's not what we want to do. So we now have a header, and we now have a footer, and then we probably also want to have content. And let's say our content is something super primitive now, and we're just going to declare that as a string headline. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to have, okay, echo. So first the header, then the content, then the footer, right? And what we have then is exactly what we expect to have here, is to say like, okay, so now we have a header, and we have our actual content, and then we have the footer, right? So far so good. But what we of course already noticed is, well, are we going to write this every time? Probably not, right? So let's do a first abstraction here, and then we have to basically well, stop it for today due to time restraints. So let's create our first class that is actually going to make sense. And we're going to say, we're going to call this output. I call this output and say, okay, this is the class that we're going to use. And then here we're basically going to say, okay, we're going to create a function construct. Now in this function construct, we're basically going to do exactly this. We're going to do exactly this. And we also want to have, we're going to make it even more primitive. Going to have it even more primitive, and I'm going to say place the content in here. And then we're going to return header, content, and footer. Okay, so in the scenario that we're using, we would basically then say, okay, where's our index? So we're going to require this output file here. This we don't need. Or actually, the content we're going to leave. And say, okay, require once output. And by the way, what I said before, you should do here as well. oops, let's be clean. And basically now can say, okay, so here's my whatever my content is, and here I basically simply going to say, oh, and we can actually do this. Yeah, why not? New output content. Should work though. Nope, I have to do a toString. Okay. Oh, it's stuck. Okay, so we're not going to return that apparently. What we're going to do instead is do a function toString, and here I'm going to say string going on here. Okay, and the must return a string, that makes sense. And here we're going to say this string equals this, and here we're going to say return this string. Okay, and now it works. So you can see now the direct result of my output is now basically this complete output. So the only thing I would write on the actual endpoint here is my content, and the header and footer would basically be taken care of. Now, that was a little bit of a hacky way, so you normally don't want to work like this. What you probably want to do instead is we're going to declare this either static, or we say no, we're going to call this print, and then say this, and that is basically the big difference. So we say, okay, output is new output content, and then here we basically can say output print, and you see it works like a charm. Yeah, so this is basically the introduction. Let's go back here. So there's so much more we need to go through, but I have to call it a day, and we make a second part in the next few days. Thank you so much for watching, and good luck. I know it's a lot of stuff at the beginning, but we want to learn something, right? So have fun, play around with it, and tell me what you think, provide feedback, and so I can basically adapt, and also ask questions, of course. So have fun, and see you soon.